Alright, this video is part one of our ecology unit lecture. It's going to start off with a few definitions. First off, ecology is the study of interactions between organisms and their environment. These interactions are important because they're going to determine the distribution or where we find these organisms and also how many of them there are. We are going to look specifically at a few different areas of ecology. The first one is population ecology. A population is a group of individuals in the same species that live together in an area, and a person that studies population ecology will focus on factors affecting how many individuals are able to live in that area. We will also talk about community ecology. Community is a bit broader than population ecology. It is a group of populations that live together in an area, and if you were studying community ecology, you would be looking at the way that the different species interact together. And finally, there's ecosystem ecology. An ecosystem is all of the organisms in the community in the area, and in addition to the physical factors where they interact. So if you were going to study ecosystem ecology, you would be interested in things like energy flow and chemical cycling amongst both the biotic or living and abiotic and non-living components. We're going to start out with population ecology. Again, the definition of a population is members of the same species that live together in the same area. That's different than a community. Community is focused on all the different populations in an area. So if we're looking at here, are we looking at a population or are we looking at a community? Hopefully you've recognized that since these are all zebras, that we're looking at a population. Another repeated definition, but just to remind ourselves, an ecosystem is the community plus the non-living factors in this area. So what you should realize is that it really gets bigger and bigger every time we go. So you start out with an organism, that'd be one individual animal, or could be a plant. And then you have a population, which is all of the individual organisms living together in the same species. Then the community, you've got different types of species that are living together. And then finally, the ecosystem takes into account the non-living factors in the area. All of this can be found, this is the even more general branch of biology, looking at the biosphere. And biosphere definition is all the areas on Earth that support life. So if you were a population ecologist, one of the things you might be interested in is demography. This is the study of a population and looking at the density, so how many per given area, the distribution, how spread out might they be, and also the rate of growth. I don't know why that came out really weird, but the rate of growth. Population density is interested in the number of individuals per unit area, whereas a distribution is looking at the pattern of dispersal. And there are three main patterns of dispersal that you can find: the random, clumped, and uniform. I'll show you an example here. So again, we're talking about patterns of distribution amongst a population, and there are three main ways that you would find those. Clumped meaning you have some that are together in various different areas. Random, there is no discernible pattern amongst the distribution, and also uniform, where everything is spaced evenly throughout. So these are the three different options when it comes to population distribution. A population ecologist would also be interested in how populations grow, and the things that they would need to look at as far as determining that is the number of births, the number of deaths, and also migration. A population is considered stable when as many individuals joining, that would be birth or immigration, when those numbers are equal to the number that leave, either by death or emigration. The formula for population change is R is going to equal the number of births minus the number of deaths plus the number of immigrants minus the number of emigrants. And we'll deal more with this population change equation in class. Biotic potential is another term that has come up already in class. This is the maximum rate which a population can grow if the conditions are optimal, meaning there is enough food and water and space for everybody. There's a few things that will influence the biotic potential. These are the age of reproduction, the frequency or how often an organism reproduces, the number of offspring produced at each reproduction, the lifespan, the reproductive lifespan, excuse me, so that means the time of life in which an individual is capable of reproducing, and also the average death rate under ideal conditions. The biotic potential will factor into the creation of a survivorship curve. Survivorship curve is the probability that a newborn will survive to a particular age, and there are 3 different types of curves. There's a late loss curve, and I'll show you an example in a second. That's called type 1. Constant loss, which is type 2, and just as a note, for constant loss, death and age are often unrelated. And finally, early loss, or type 3. So let's take a look at those. Again, you could have a late loss, or type 1. That is the red curve on the top. You could have constant loss, or type 2, death unrelated to age. That is the orange one. And then you could have early loss, which is blue, type 3, which is down towards the bottom. Some examples of organisms that have different types of these curves. So grasses, bluegrass here specifically, would be considered a type 1 curve. Additionally, humans are considered type 1, meaning late loss. Birds are the most common example of a type 2 curve where death is unrelated to age. And finally, most insects are really good examples of early loss, or type 3 curves. There are other type of curves that population ecologists might use. One of them, well, they're called population curves, and there's 2 main types. You can have a J-shaped population curve. In this situation, the population has not yet reached its carrying capacity, and J-shaped curve requires unlimited resources. And you can also have an S-shaped curve, and this is when you have reached some type of equilibrium and you're starting to see some deceleration. Some important things to note from this graph. One is the carrying capacity, which we're going to talk about in a second. Let's talk about right now. So carrying capacity here is the maximum size of a species that an environment can sustain indefinitely, given the food, habitat, and water and other necessities that are available from the environment. So you can see in red, this is a typical carrying capacity figure. Carrying capacity usually starts with some type of overshoot and then will sort of settle around a particular area going up and down. The blue line here is showing sort of a smoothed average of the data where you have more of a steady line. Again, that's the maximum number of individuals that an environment can sustain. Going back to the J and S-shaped curves, I was going to show you an example of a population growth curve that is J and a population growth curve that is S. So we're going to start with some data involving dragonflies, and we're just looking at different generations and how big the population is. And if we were to graph that data, what we would see is a J-shaped curve. These are exhibiting exponential growth, so you can see that there. And you would see something like this when they have not encountered something that would lessen the amount of individuals that in a particular environment can withstand. Now to look at an S-shaped curve, I'm going to show you some data for yeast cells. And again, this is time and number of individuals. And if we were to look at the graph for that, you would see what is considered S-shaped. In an S-shaped curve, you're going to have a period of exponential growth. And then that growth is going to slow down and you're going to reach some type of stable equilibrium phase. So when you have yeast cells grown in culture, there becomes a time in which there is just not enough food or space for all of the yeast cells to survive. This is another example of a population curve that will eventually start to settle down. So in the beginning, it's exhibiting exponential growth. So there's a J-shaped curve, and then all of a sudden there would be a sudden resource depletion, which means that curve would then drop fairly rapidly off. Population fluctuations are one of the more fascinating phenomena in ecology, and some are really interested in looking at how these can cycle in particular environments. And kind of the classic example is the predator-prey cycle. So here we're looking at both the population of lynx and the population of hare in a particular area over a number of years. And what you can see, if you start to really look at it, is as the population of the snowshoe hare increases, so does the population of lynx. That reaches a particular point where you start to see the snowshoe hare population decreasing, and then because the population of their prey is decreasing, the population of the predator or the lynx is also decreasing. So this is a very common cycle that's seen in predator-prey population graphs. When it comes to regulation of the population size, there are a few things that play a role. We can break them into classifications, one of them being density-independent factors and density-dependent factors. So a density-independent factor does not depend on the number of individuals in a particular population. Classic examples are weather and other natural disasters. Density-dependent factors do depend on the number of individuals in a given population, and examples for these are food, space, water, etc. So just an example, here we have two different populations, and then there was a large flood. That is a density-independent factor, meaning it does not matter how big the population is. In each case, there was 60% loss of the population, so we consider it density-independent. An example of a density-dependent factor is here. So we have birds, and they all live in the same environment in the tree, and as the number increases, not all of them will have access to the resources, so there becomes a point in which some are not able to find suitable homes. That is considered a density-dependent factor that would control population growth. There are different strategies that organisms will utilize as far as how it comes to population growth. You can have an R strategist or a K strategist. R strategists typically are very small organisms. There's not a lot of energy used to make each individual. They will produce many offspring. They don't live very long, and they tend to be relatively small. These are type 3 survivorship curves. Those are different than K strategists. These are larger organisms. They don't produce as many offspring. They live longer, and they typically have more than one lifetime reproductive event. And these are usually type 1 or type 2 survivorship curves. We also call our strategists opportunistic. So you have weeds, those are a big one. Also, most insects also are considered opportunistics or are strategists. Again, they're small, they don't live very long, they mature quickly, they have a lot of offspring. Different than someone that has an equilibrium life history or a K strategist, large individuals, long lifespan, etc. So humans, elephants, bears. A population ecologist is also very interested in reproduction rates. So they will look at a reproductive table, and this is the summary of reproductive rates within a given population. And when that's measured over a long span of time, you can get some interesting information. So let me show you an example. This is a reproductive table. You would use a reproductive table to create an age structure diagram, which will give you information about reproductive age individuals within a given population. If you have a population that's increasing, it would make sense that you would have a lot more individuals in the pre-reproductive and reproductive ages than in post-reproductive. Stable population tends to have same number of individuals in each. If the population size is decreasing, then the pre-reproductive and reproductive age groups would be smaller than the post-reproductive age groups. You can look at these in regards to the type of country that they're from. Most developed countries, like the United States, has a relatively stable reproductive age structure diagram, whereas if you're looking at less developed countries, typically they'll have many more individuals in the pre-reproductive and reproductive age group. That does it for the population part of the ecology lecture.